Topic 46. The United States during World War II. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you will need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to identify the main Allied and Axis powers during World War II, identify the immediate cause and exact start date of the United States participation in the conflict, identify the month and year, identify the cause and date of the end of World War II in the Pacific Theater, describe 3 effects of World War II on the United States during wartime, and describe 3 effects of World War II on the U.S. after the war ended. As you learned during Podcast 43, the U.S. followed a policy of isolationism following World War I. While many Americans continued to try and ignore the rise of fascism in Germany, Italy, and Japan, the 3 nations that would head the Axis powers during the 1930s, it became more difficult to support an isolationist foreign policy as news of totalitarian aggression reached American shores. 18 months after the official outbreak of World War II on September 1, 1939, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt convinced the U.S. Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. This law, formally called an Act to Promote the Defense of the United States, provided food, oil, and war materiel to Britain and China. Later, this aid also went to the Soviet Union and Free France. These 4 would become our primary allies after Japan bombed a U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7, 1941. This action led to the American entry into the war the next day. The war lasted until 1945, claimed between 50 to 85 million lives, and involved almost every nation on the globe. The deadliest conflict in human history, World War II represents a prime example of total war, in which nations' entire economic, industrial, and scientific capacities were marshaled toward the war effort. The war included not only conventional battles and strategic bombing, but also the genocide of the Holocaust, in which more than 6 million European Jews were killed in German concentration camps, the use of rape as a weapon of war by the Japanese in China, and the first and only use of nuclear weapons in war by the United States against Japan. The war ended following the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, seen here on the left and right, on August 6th and 9th, 1945, respectively. While the approximately 400,000 military casualties that the United States suffered during the war are horrible, it is important to remember that those suffered by its allies, China and the Soviet Union, dwarf this number. The USSR lost approximately 10 million military and another 14 million civilians. China lost about 6 million from its military and another 14 million civilians. Nevertheless, World War II's impact on the American home front was profound. By supplying the Allies with food, oil, and war materiel like tanks, ammunition, bombs, and the like through the Lend-Lease Act, the United States itself experienced shortages of food, oil, steel, and even lumber during these years. These items were rationed. Americans received ration cards which allotted them a certain amount of foodstuffs every week and often had to wait online to receive them, here for sugar. Since some items like dairy were in such short supply, products like margarine took the place of scarce butter. The U.S. government also waged a propaganda campaign to urge Americans to buy war bonds and grow their own food in gardens, nicknamed Victory Gardens, and to conserve other foodstuffs being sent to our allies and the troops abroad. The absence of those troops from the workplace opened opportunities for other historically marginalized groups. Another propaganda campaign featured the idealized Rosie the Riveter, encouraged women to take jobs in factories producing airplanes, ships, and other war materials. Thanks to labor leader A. Philip Randolph, who threatened a march on Washington if President Roosevelt refused to desegregate factories that received federal military contracts, African Americans also sought and received jobs in wartime factories. After the war, however, both women and African Americans experienced the last hired, first fired effect when former soldiers and sailors wanted jobs. Immigrants from Mexico filled agricultural labor shortages during the war through the Bracero program, or the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement. The Migration Labor Agreement of 1951 extended the Bracero program until 1964. Between 1947 and 64, approximately 200,000 Mexican Americans came to the United States every year to pick lettuce, beets, grapes, and other crops in the fields of the West. Southern California experienced tremendous growth during the war, not just through immigration from Mexico, but more importantly as the departure point for the Pacific Theater through which thousands of American servicemen left and to which they often returned after the war. Caucasian servicemen and some young, longtime residents of Los Angeles came to blows during the Zoot Suit riots. In March 1942, the War Production Board reduced the amount of wool that manufacturers could use. As a result, new streamlined style of men's suits quickly emerged to conform with the WPB's new regulations. Zoot suits, however, with their baggy pants and long jackets, continued to be produced by manufacturers who flouted the law. These suits were often worn by Mexican, African, and Filipino American young men, who were targeted as un-American by the Caucasian servicemen passing through LA on their way to the war, despite the fact that Mexican Americans were both overrepresented in the military and among Medal of Honor winners. In June 1943, fights between the two groups in Los Angeles escalated into riots that later triggered attacks against Latinos in Chicago, New York, Detroit, and elsewhere. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt condemned the attacks, but many European Americans in Los Angeles and elsewhere supported them. 1960s civil rights activists Cesar Chavez and Malcolm X were both Zoot Suiters during their youth. But the most egregious incidence of racial intolerance during the war was the internment of thousands of Japanese-born and Japanese-American citizens, as well as much smaller numbers of those of German and Italian ancestry. President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 declared that anyone of Japanese ancestry could be, quote, excluded from military areas, unquote, such as all of California and other parts of the West, except if they were placed in camps. By the spring of 1942, almost all of the mainland U.S.'s 130,000 Japanese were forcibly placed in government camps located throughout the Midwest and West. In 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of this executive order in Korematsu v. U.S. 4 decades later, after a commission found scant evidence of Japanese disloyalty, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 declared that the government instead acted on race prejudice and awarded $20,000 to each surviving prisoner of the camps. Despite these terrible incidents of racial intolerance, the use of nuclear weapons in Japan, and the tragic loss of life around the globe, World War II was, in many ways, a crucible for a better America. The enormous amount of money that the government put into supplying the Allied war effort finally picked the U.S. out of the Depression and kick-started a period of economic growth that only slowed down in the 1970s. Serving in units of mixed ethnicities and races took the hyphenated identity out of the children of immigrants in a way that the Americanization campaigns of the 1920s never could. Servicemen brought their strengthened sense of Americanness home with them. The horrors of the Holocaust also made anti-Semitism much less acceptable in polite circles. Moreover, when President Truman followed Roosevelt's desegregation of military contractors with Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the actual military itself in 1948, this sense of who was an American also began to encompass African Americans in a way it never had. This development certainly paved the road for the emergence of the civil rights movement during the 1950s. Nevertheless, though many forces in the United States desired to turn the United States towards isolationism, today, our experience in World War II forever ended that as a viable foreign policy. Like it or not, World War II cemented America's position as a leader on the world stage for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. Recall the learning objectives for this podcast. Write each one in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of the learning objectives on the screen now. Good luck!